Welcome to the Trouble with Writing podcast, where we chat about the real issues that stop multilingual writers from producing effective English and see where we can help. Hi, Pete. Hi, Phil. How's it going this week?
Hello, guys.
Hey, Phil. Hey, Paul. How are you doing?
Great.
We're excited.
What's new and exciting?
What's new and exciting? Well, it's World Cup time, so Pete and I are eagerly awaiting England's glorious victory against the United States. And I guess we'll see how terrible that statement is by the time the podcast comes out.
Yeah, we don't want to be overconfident. The US have some really good young players, right?
I've heard from a Brazilian student of mine that Canada has a team. I had no idea. Is it true? Or is it just rumor?
Yeah.
Pretty decent team.
Yeah.
Is that right?
They played very well the other day, right? They lost, I think, to Belgium, I think it was. But they actually played very well. Unfortunately, they missed a penalty. They deserved more from the game, definitely.
Oh, that's encouraging. I to be honest with you, I'm not a fan. I'm just sort of following it through the news and through my students, basically. But
yeah. The funny thing about the World Cup and football in general, right, is that some games can be really boring. You can just have it on, but kind of fall asleep or be doing something else. And other games can really, really pull you into them. They can be really, you just can't take your eyes off the screen. That's sometimes a little bit like reading, right? Have you ever read a book where actually it's pretty boring and you find that you're not really paying attention? The words are kind of going in like one eye and out of the other eye. And there are other books that you just can't put them down, right? Like, why is this?
It's a good point. I certainly have that experience.
It's definitely more common nowadays, isn't it? Because there's infinite material to read. You just go online and you can read anything. I mean, read in a different way online, maybe. But it's something I've noticed with my reading and with, I think pretty much everyone I speak to says the same, that it's harder to, not necessarily harder to focus, but maybe we're not as immersed in reading as we used to be, right?
Do you guys still buy books? And I'm sure, I'm just guessing, I don't know, but are you also the kind of guys that buy books and have a stack of books that you're getting to, and meanwhile you'll still buy new ones? I still do that, even though I barely read anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading more on my Kindle, and sometimes I have a wish list. I try to avoid buying books before I finish the ones I've read, but sometimes I still do that. But your question there is interesting because I was talking to my dad the other day, and he was saying that when he reads on the Kindle, or the e-reader, he finds he gets distracted. So he'll read something that he's interested in, and then he'll select it and then go on to Wikipedia or something to find out about it. And he just gets distracted and he forgets what his goal is, which is to read the book and not to kind of go off on one.
Do you guys, I guess I'd like to know what your thoughts are about the connection between reading habits and, let's say, your writing or the writing that you coach. Do you think there's a connection?
100%. I mean, for me, it's just writing draws a lot of similarities as a skill to language. It's input and output. And in the case of writing, the reading is the input. And I think what's difficult for a lot of people, myself included, and really all writers, is making the connection between what is going in and then what's really going on with that writing and how to produce it yourself, not just reading it as a consumer. Pete, you're nodding there.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in this concept of reading as a writer, right? So I wanted to ask you guys, what does that mean to you to read as a writer?
Great question. Phil, any thoughts first while I contemplate?
Yeah, I'll let you gather your thoughts. I mean, one of my things that I often give advice about is to read like a writer, and that means to read twice. So the first thing we do when we read is read for understanding, read as a consumer, right? You get an email and you want to understand it, know what it says and what you have to do. Let's say you've got a great email marketing campaign and you found yourself clicking, subscribe or buy, and you happen to be someone who also wants to produce that kind of writing. It's important that you go back to it and ask questions, breaking down, how it achieves the effect that it does. There are several different elements of that, maybe things we've talked about in the past, like structural style or choice of vocabulary. But it's really interrogating each section of the writing and asking the question, what's really happening here? And I think if you can do that, then that's where you get some insight to improve yourself.
Yeah, I found that earlier in my life, when I read constantly fiction, I found myself inspired by what I was consuming, and inspired and moved. But part of that, I also recognized that part of that was in the storytelling, wondering what will become of the character and what will happen at the end of the story. And once I got to that point, read it and knew it, if I read it again, I would start to notice other details because I knew the story. And it's almost like my mind would notice other things happening, like structural things or linguistic things, writing technique, because I already knew what would happen in the story. And as I recognized that, and I'm talking about when I was pretty young, I realized that there's someone behind this story who's made any number of decisions for me to arrive at this reading experience. And that's what inspired me to write also, because I felt like I was seeing behind the curtain and recognizing the voice of an author, the presence of an author, and then wanting to try that myself and experimenting with it. But I agree that I think that reading and writing are two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And I think any writer was probably inspired from what they read. Do you feel a similar thing in your experience, Pete?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was also thinking while you were talking there about, so Phil was saying, you read the first time just as a normal reader, right? You want to get the main ideas, right? And then you might reread as a writer. And then you ask yourself certain questions, things like, this is really engaging me. Like, why? Like, what techniques is the writer using so that I can't put this book down, right?
Yeah. What's the magic?
I actually, because we were going to do this podcast, I kind of went through this a little bit when I was reading yesterday, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So I was reading this book. I'm reading this book at the moment. I just finished it, in fact. It's called The File. It's by Timothy Garton Ash. And it's basically, if you haven't heard of it, basically he lived in East Berlin during the Cold War, right? And the East German secret police had a file on him, right? So what he did was he investigated a file that the police had on him and wrote this book, right? And I was just reading this yesterday, and just this is a really engaging book. I think he's such a good writer, and I was reading through and just asking myself these questions, like what techniques is he using? Like, what is engaging me? And if you like, I could just share a few, maybe.
Please.
For example, one thing that he did in this paragraph, I'll read it to you. Or maybe you'll notice yourself when I read it, right? So tell me what you think he's doing here that is making this more, like, what technique is he using? He says, it was just so lucky in the country of my birth, lucky in my privileged background, my parents, my education, lucky in true friends like James and Werner, lucky in my Juliet, lucky in my choice of profession, lucky too in my cause.
Repetition, right? Of lucky, quite obviously, and Yeah, we talked before, didn't we, about avoiding repetition and, choosing synonyms or different word forms, but it can be really effective if you want to drive home a point.
Yeah.
That's great. It's very poetic.
Yeah. Here's another one that is kind of similar, but not exactly the same. So he said, maybe start from the beginning of the sentence. I can't quite bring myself to say Brother Romeo of the man who informed for the Stasi as I am Romeo and is now media representative for the post-communists. But I can understand each of the informers in my file and the officers too, even Cratch. For when they tell their stories, you can see so clearly how they came to do what they did in a different time, a different place, a different world.
More repetition there. Different.
Is that all one sentence? Am I right in thinking that, or is it a couple of sentences?
That is all one sentence. It's quite a long sentence.
Yeah.
The part it's the part at the end that I also noticed, right? So he's using this this parallelism, right, in threes. It's quite a common writing technique to do things in threes, right? Again, it's like what you said, Paul. Sounds like quite poetic, gives it more emphasis, right? In a different time, a different place, a different world.
It's also nice the way it comes at the end of a long snaking sentence and sort of brings the whole thing to a powerful halt with those last three punches. I like that.
Excellent point.
I really appreciate rhythm like that in sentences.
Yeah. There's actually
created from the arrangement of sentences.
Yeah, there's actually a dash before that last part. So before in a different time, a different place, a different world, there's a dash. So yeah, that really gives it the rhythm. Shall I just do one more?
Please.
Go for it. Pete's done his homework this episode.
Yeah, I love it.
All the listeners can tell who's prepared.
Yeah, I've got a few more, but I don't want to dominate this, so I'll just do one.
Great.
This sentence really engaged me. So he said, if only I had met on this search a single clearly evil person, period. Right. That sentence does that really engage you? Do you just want to read on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very precise and concise. Word choices.
It also leaves us without some key information, like who is this person? So we want to find out. It compels us forward.
And why does he want? Why does he say? Why does he wish he had met a single clearly evil person? And we know because of that sentence that he didn't. Right. It's just this if only. I think is quite a powerful use of language. Things like if only, I wish I had. These kind of sentence starters work well to build this intrigue.
I think those are great examples, Pete, and I think that's really good to sort of show listeners what to look out for and how to identify certain techniques, and I'm sure many of them are doing that already. In my experience, some might get more lost at what to look for outside of that, the bigger picture or other aspects of the writing. What do you guys think that people can look out for in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that's where structure pertains, right? Structure is the sort of hidden skeleton behind a work of fiction. It's the story, the plot. It's also true in academic work, where I think structure, it's not the same as a story, but there has to be a structure underlying, because academic writing tends to embrace the complexities of some topic. So how do you make sense of that for a reader? The structure of an academic paper, for example, is the sequence by which you dole out the information step by step, so that the reader will absorb it, learn what they need to know to understand the next piece of information. So in that kind of work that I do, that sense of structure has to predominate. And that's really sort of encapsulated early on in the presentation of a thesis. I always think like locked inside the thesis is the DNA for the whole paper, right?
Yeah, good point.
How about for you, Pete?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you're talking about like the overall structure, and that depends on the genre, how much does that translate from one language to another, right? So like how similar or different is the structure of a paper, an academic paper, in different languages, right?
Great question.
And therefore, do non-native writers, do they find the global structure of their writing more challenging, or is it more these details, like these little writing techniques and things like this? Like, what do they find most challenging?
Well, in my experience working, let's compare, say, South American writers with Asian writers. The South American writers tend to write structurally in the same way a British or a Canadian or American writer would, although their style may be quite different, owing to the sort of translation of thought presentation through the language. But the Asian writers actually have grown up learning a very different way of presenting information with a lot more implication, a lot more, they're expected to imply things rather than make them explicit. A very simple example is a Japanese writer may have learned not to present the thesis explicitly in an introduction. They may have been taught to wait until the conclusion to summarize their take on a particular topic. Whereas when I teach them, if you're going to school in the US or Canada, people are going to want to know what your opinion is upfront and central. And then they'll say to me, oh, but then there's no surprise. And I say, well, wait a minute. The surprise isn't your topic or how you feel about it. The surprise is in the details of how you arrive at that conclusion. And that's what they're going to read in the essay. But you need to tell them your take immediately. Otherwise, people will not be engaged. Phil, have you experienced anything like that in your end of things?
I was just listening and finding it really, really interesting, Paul, the difference between, what you said about implication and how I think that's something that can definitely be misunderstood. I was thinking structure-wise for a lot of digital writing, for a lot of typical forms of writing, we live in a more global world and we expect to see writing and arguments and stories set out in a certain way. But definitely that information gap, like how much of a jump readers can or should make in their culture is a really interesting point. So
I think it also depends on what they're going to do with their, let's say, their English writing. If they're studying in the UK or Canada or US, they're going to be expected to follow the formats of that particular context, right? So they do need to learn it, which isn't to say it's better or the correct way.
Sure.
It's just context motivated. If they're learning to write in English, but within the context of, let's say, an Asian academic setting, it really depends on who their professors are and what's expected. But I always present it as these are options. You should have command of different forms. Pete, thoughts?
Yeah. I was I was thinking. So, like what you're saying there is that in our culture, right, the writing culture is very much, we go from the general to the specific, right? So, in your case, working with academic English, preparing students for IELTS, things like this, right? They're taught to have a topic sentence, right, and then develop that with supporting arguments, details, examples, this type of thing. And like what you're saying is that, so I think I'm right. So Japanese writers in their language, they might start with the details first and then go on to the general idea, right? And then
the topic sentence may be right into the detail or an example rather than declaring what the paragraph is about.
Yeah. And so what also comes into play here is, so it's the audience on the one hand, right? So we're saying that, if they're writing for their professors who are British or Canadian, or and if they're writing for an English-speaking audience, then there's that factor. That would be an argument to use the general first, specific later structure, right? But on the other hand, I'm also thinking here about kind of individual style, right? So we don't want to be so kind of rigid that we like force non-native writers to write according to our cultural expectations, right? Because remember, what we want is we want them to share their voice, for different cultures to share their voice in a common language, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think for me, this goes back to bringing it back to reading and knowing, who is your audience and what's expected culturally and what's the norm of that kind of writing. Always comes back to reading. What are some great examples of what you are trying to write? That should be one of the prime things that writers are reading, is examples from their field. If you want to write a novel, then you can read newspapers, but it won't necessarily help you to adopt that approach to write a novel, right? You might really enjoy reading newspapers. Don't stop doing that, but also you need to read novels to get up to speed on that. Paul?
Well, yeah, I was just going to add exactly that becomes a huge challenge for me, because when I work with a student who's in their early 20s, for example, preparing for university, whatever language they're from, they've probably read some novels or literature or even comics from within their culture. Most cultures have a literary tradition, but very, very few of them have read academic journals or research papers. So when I teach them a course in research paper writing, for example, it's like baking a cake from a recipe, never having eaten a cake or even seen one. So one of the first things I need to do is assign a few sample papers for them to read, just to see what it is, just to see what it reads like, just to see how it's presented typographically and visually. Otherwise, the results are, when I first started teaching that kind of work, I found the results were really strange because they didn't see an objective. They had no clear picture of what it should be like. Whereas if I asked them, okay, guys, write a novel or a short story, most of them could come up with some rudimentary production because they've all experienced it or seen it or, I don't know. Just you need to see examples to understand what the objective should be, right? We all need to have eaten some cake at some point.
Just a very quick one. I wanted to jump in and say you're making academic journals sound very tasty by calling them a cake. I might think of them as maybe something more scientific, like the perfect loaf of bread or something like that. But it's your metaphor. I think the best, roll with it.
Yeah, I think the best academic writers and those academics who have reached a wide audience, like eventually doing television documentaries, for example, those people write. Like Professor Cox, the British guy who's now touring the world with his science presentations. Mm-hmm. I've read some of his work, and his writing is fantastic. It's academic writing, but he takes it to a literary level. So I'm a firm believer that academic writing can be beautiful and engaging and enjoyable. Most students just haven't experienced those examples, right? Though in their past, they've experienced really dry and awful cake. Not a delicious, I don't know what cake is delicious. Cheesecake. I'm a fan of cheesecake. Yeah.
So what's your favorite cake?
My favorite cake, chocolate cake, I guess. Yeah. I was going to say that that is a common mistake, maybe, that some students make. In the past, I've had also students preparing for an academic exam like IELTS, and then they say to me, maybe you could recommend a good novel to read. And I say to them, well, actually, what you want to read is more, read the news, things like this. It's going to help you more with your IELTS, because if you read a novel, you're not going to get exposure to the type of language that you need to use in your IELTS, right? And what I find with my students now, they are actually quite good at knowing what they should be reading. So now that I'm teaching journalists, a lot of them, they already read in English the types of articles that they want to write in. I think that's great. So I'm wondering if your students, if you find that they need more advice with what to read, or if they already have the hang of that and they already know what they should be reading.
Yeah, good question.
Do you want to go first, Paul? You can answer that.
Yeah, I guess we're talking about reading habits, aren't we? What kind of reading we should do and prescribe. In general, I always tell my students, I just have this mantra of read everything. Read the label on your soap. Everything is a different genre of reading, right? Read the toothpaste tube. That's a different genre of writing. And it's good to have a cross section to refer to. But I absolutely agree. It's the cake metaphor. You have to read the examples of what you're planning to write. If you want to write fiction, you've got to read the masters. That's why it's worthwhile to take a literature course rather than a creative writing course. If you want to be a writer, you have to study the masters so that when you begin producing work, you have a reference, a body of reference that you can draw on when you're evaluating your own work. And I believe the same is true for the academic writer or the student. They've got to read the thing that they're making. They've got to eat the cake that they're trying to imitate with the recipe, so to speak, again. Reading habits. All reading is good and beneficial for writing, I believe. But you've got to read the material that you're trying to produce, I think. Does that resonate with you, Phil?
Yeah, for sure. And I think good point, Pete, about journalists. And people in general know what they should be reading, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it. I think I recommend the 3 categories of reading that people should do. Writers, especially if you want to produce that kind of work. And they should come in this order. First, read what you enjoy, because you want to promote your reading and do as much of that as possible. So if you enjoy novels, but you're writing, for a newspaper, then that's absolutely fine. Keep doing that. Yeah. The second is what we just talked about, the reading good examples from the field that you're producing writing for. And the third would be the craft articles or books, books which are about how to write better. So I think that's another key aspect. And I'll just add one final thing, that more important almost than what to read is having a strategy of not just saying, oh, I'll get to that eventually, or I'll read it if it's important. It's having some kind of system to make sure that you're regularly reading, and it's not just in the 10 minutes before bed when you're scrolling your phone and you're going to fall asleep. So sort of planning that input as an integral part of your learning.
Yeah, Pete, what's your...
So for me, a really key word is noticing, right? And you have to know what to notice. So that's why when you said there, Phil, reading books about writing is also really important, because if students only read the types of text that they want to write in, that is it's an excellent first step. It's really fundamental. But if they only do that, the benefits are limited. So the benefits are they get exposure to the language, right? And they get a lot of implicit knowledge, right? So it's like if you don't have any idea about grammar or writing techniques or anything, right? but you still had a lot of exposure from text, good quality text, the types of text that you want to write. When it comes to writing, you get a feeling, right? You kind of feel what sounds good, what doesn't sound good, what sounds engaging, and what sounds boring, this type of thing, right? But you want to go a step further, right? You want to have also build up an explicit knowledge of really useful writing techniques that you can use, right? And we've talked before about vocabulary, right? So you want all this explicit knowledge. So which leads me on to my next question. Do you guys have like a favorite book about writing that you would recommend our listeners?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, mate,
yours?
I'll let Paul go first because we've all, just to explain, we've all selected one book, right, that we're going to tell the listeners about. Mine's not explicitly about writing, but I will share it in a minute. Maybe, Paul, do you want to go first? What's your book?
Before I do so, just to add to what you were saying, Pete, it goes back to what Phil mentioned earlier about interrogating the reading, having the tools to understand what choices this writer is making, whether it's structural or stylistic. One of the things I remember, I can't remember if I read it, figured it out, or heard it when I was young and a big fan of the cinema, was the idea of mise en scène, which means everything in the frame. And I realized or learned that in a film, absolutely everything you see or hear is there for a reason, because it was someone's choice and filtered through the director. And there's hundreds of people making a film, and at no time are there accidents that don't really get noticed. So if someone walks onto the set to appear in a shot and they're wearing a green shirt and it should be blue, someone's going to notice that. Mistakes get made, but the idea is that whatever ends up in the final analysis on screen is there for some reason. It's a choice. And the same is true of writing. Writers don't just sit down and, in a first draft, perhaps let it all out and resort to their intuitive writing. But eventually the writing is crafted for purpose, for effect. As we noticed in Pete's examples, those stylistic choices are there. But you've got to learn what those techniques and choices are based on, right? In academic writing, I've read, I don't know, as we all have, dozens of texts and textbooks and handbooks. And they all have something to offer. And they've all enriched my understanding of the craft. And as we were talking about earlier, reading the examples, and again, you've got to interrogate it, but you need those tools that allow you to ask the right questions with your sort of top-down knowledge. And I don't want to say it's the best book, but it's my favorite book to recommend to student writers of academic writing. It's called Focus on Writing, Paragraphs and Essays. And it is by Laura G. Kirshner and Stephen R. Mandel. It's a big book. It's not small, but right away you can see it's kind of color-coded. The way things are presented in this is not just raw text. Things are very colorfully and graphically laid out and key ideas highlighted. And there are sample paragraphs, sample essays, and they interrogate the text. For example, things like this, you see examples of text, and the way it's presented is an interrogation of the text. Or this, you can see how different elements are highlighted and explained. And I think reading that stuff teaches a student how to do it for themselves when they encounter a text. It's very comprehensive. It explores different types of essays, which all the textbooks seem to do. But what I love about this is its focus on the key building blocks, which are paragraphs. There's an extensive section where they go into how a paragraph develops, how an idea develops through the paragraphs, so that a student is learning not just how to write or how to structure or how to outline, but how to build an idea and present it to a potential reader in a way that's understandable, but also thorough. Because in academic text at some point, they may have to write an enormous paragraph that really details a single idea. Because one of the challenges I face when I work with international students is the superficiality of their idea. They don't know how to take an idea, even if they strongly believe it, and really break it down to its constituent elements and present that to a reader so that the reader understands how they arrived at that idea. For me, all of that happens inside the paragraph, and that's like 80% of the work I do with them is focused on paragraph development, idea development. And this book presents all the techniques of doing that. So that's my recommendation, lads. Focus on Writing, Paragraphs and Essays by Laurie Kirshner and Stephen Mandel. And by the way, we should put the links to all these books on Amazon below so people can get a copy if they want. But I highly recommend that one.
Other booksellers are available.
Yeah,
it looks really useful, Paul. And I love how it's color-coded too, because I think, different learners, some styles of learning doesn't match up well with, huge blocks of text and lots of description. Yeah. And if things are color-coded and presented in a visual way, I think that's so helpful because then you can apply that to the new writing that you see and break down.
Absolutely.
And you can, see these constituent parts, like you said. So that sounds great.
It's great, and there's endless examples of how to analyze a text, how to proofread and revise and edit a text. It's very, very comprehensive. And even at the back in the appendices, there are some stylistic sections, just going over good grammar and good sentence structure matters. Sort of an all-in-one package. And although it's an academic guidebook, the writing itself, the explanations themselves are written in a very accessible register. So great book. How about you guys?
What was your recommendation, Pete?
Okay, I'll go. So, so mine is it's a book by Harold Evans. It's called Do I Make Myself Clear? Why Writing Well Matters. Okay, so for people who haven't heard of Harold Evans, it's actually Sir Harold Matthew Evans, right? So he was a British-American journalist and writer. And he was knighted in 2004 for services to journalism. And so this book is very much with a journalistic style, right? Parts of it are really, really engaging too, and tell stories, quite a lot of storytelling. And I just find that this book just has amazing tips on writing techniques for journalists. So when I was, as you know, I did my homework. I always do my homework, and I was looking back through it, just the first part, and I just came across again just so many useful tips on things like sentence structure, right? So I think we talked about this in another episode. So it's varying the sentence structure, right? We don't want every sentence to be made of the simple structure, but we want a mixture between simple, compound, complex, because we want writing to be clear but not boring, right?
Yeah.
So many great tips like this, things like the problem with the passive voice, right? So this is there we go. Look, great, we've got it up on the screen. This is a very well-known problem with the passive voice that we're not saying don't ever use the passive. That will be wrong, right? Sometimes the passive is necessary, right? For example, if we don't know who the person is that is saying something, then we're going to use the passive, right? But a lot of the time, the passive, it just adds more words. It kind of it takes the life out of writing. It makes writing less abstract, right? Sorry, more abstract. So many great tips. One that I really like is when he talks about be specific, right? So he's really strong on this. Avoid vague language, right? Abstract nouns, and it's really interesting. He quoted a philosopher, I forget the name right now, but there's this idea that if you have vague language, a lot of abstract nouns, then the reader has to translate those thoughts, right? So you're actually giving the reader much more work to do, right? And again, it just takes out the life, the energy out of your writing. There's quite a lot of these. I won't go into all of them, but the book is just full of great tips. I think we also talked about in another episode, be positive, right? Use positive sentences. For example, I noted one down. If you say they did not pay attention to the claim, right? Better, they ignored the claim, right?
Yeah.
If you use these negative sentences, it's slower, it's harder to understand. So use positive sentences. But yeah, I'd really recommend this book to all journalists. So native, non-native, doesn't matter. It's a must. If you're an aspiring journalist, then definitely read this book.
That's great. I love that tip about the negatives. That's a personal pet peeve of mine. I always tell my students, it's not vivid. I can't picture something that doesn't exist, right? Like he didn't walk across the street. What does that look like? Looks like nothing. Great stuff. Great tips. Sounds like
all right,
I'm going to get a copy of that book.
Phil?
Yeah, I'm interested in it too. I haven't read it, but I have downloaded a sample of it, so I will be dipping into that for sure. My book, as I said, that I'm going to recommend is not directly about writing. It is simply a fiction anthology. There are tons and tons of anthologies out there, but I'll share it and talk about why I think it's a good example, I suppose. Let me just share it here. Yeah. So the book that I've chosen is a book called That Glimpse of Truth, which is an anthology which collects 100 of the best short stories ever written, according to the editor, David Miller. It's his opinion, really. They're not necessarily the best stories ever, but they're certainly excellent examples from throughout history. So we've got lots of different nationalities of writers covered, not just in the English-speaking world. I think there might be some sort of Joseph Conrad and other non-native writers in there too. It spans history, as I said, so short stories going back, 200 plus years, which really is going to give readers such a rich vocabulary and, different look at how English used to be and how things have transformed. Mostly I'm recommending it because I hope that more people, I think, especially with the sort of fast-paced business, get ahead in business and, make your six-figure business and that kind of stuff that we see online so much nowadays. I hope that some writers get back to reading more fiction, because I think non-fiction is certainly great and useful, and we need to read it, and it's going to teach us all these great things about writing. But within fiction, you're going to see like a massive variety of language, of sentence construction, of creative use of language, of literary techniques, so many things that can help your own writing, regardless of what that is. So that's my recommendation. As I said, really, any best of short fiction anthology. Oh, final point on short stories as well. That's sort of one of my passions, but I think they're great because you can really unpick a moment of change or a different type of storytelling that occurs in a short story, as opposed to novels which are more that traditional sort of rise and fall and rise structure, right? Like a movie.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. I have a question. Maybe it's pointing to a future podcast, but I believe one of the benefits of reading fiction is it develops empathy because it places you in the perspective of a character who may or may not be similar to you. In fact, the best experiences are when you're in a character that's extremely different and you develop a sense of how they see the world and how they experience it. And I wonder, in this world we live in now that's so polarized and so divisive, certainly in North America, I wonder if that's related to people reading fiction less, or, let's say literary fiction. I wonder if there's some correlation, because I think empathy is, I don't want to say lost, but there seems to be a dearth of empathy out there in the world. And real empathy, not like, oh, I feel bad for him, but understanding how they may be seeing the world from their perspective. Whereas in an earlier generation, we grew up reading. What do you think of that idea, guys? Is that far-fetched? Am I reaching?
I would say, I don't know if I'm going off on one a little bit, but I would say the main problem is social media.
Yeah.
The way that social media has advanced and the technology has made such rapid advances, but culture is lagging behind.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much polarization because we haven't learned how to use social media in a civilized way. That would be
I also worry that I agree, and I also worry that it has supplanted the time we would otherwise spend reading things like fiction.
Good point.
I don't know.
I would say it's very difficult to make sweeping statements like that. I mean, I would definitely say that reading fiction doesn't hurt anyone and is great for empathy, and I recommend that we all do more of it. I think if you look back 100 years, 200 years, people were not very culturally sensitive, to put it mildly, because their consumption of media, be it they couldn't read or they didn't read or there wasn't any other media, meant that they didn't build that empathy. And I think now we certainly still have a lot of huge problems to deal with, but social media and our use of digital media is still so new that we're not very good at it yet.
No.
That's why we go back to the easiest. We fall on the easiest sort of copywriting, screaming in your face type of media, and that's what's getting eyeballs. It's not the deeper, meaningful storytelling, and hopefully that will develop over time.
Mm. I always think one of the problems of the relationship between humans and their technology is that we're always quick to embrace the possible, and we engineer and produce something because we are able to. And what lags behind is the ethics involved, whether we should use this or shouldn't use this. People research that and think about it later, after the fact. First thing is, wow, we can make a cell phone. Let's do it because we can. So, yeah, that's just another thought that struck me when we're talking about anthologies of short fiction. I think we all need to read more short fiction, and long form for that matter. But short form, maybe in our hyperactive, attention deprived world, maybe short fiction is really a more reasonable expectation.
Yeah, I just wanted to say as well that so in business, right, entrepreneurs, this idea of build your six-figure business, all this type of thing, people are using storytelling, right? Storytelling is where it's at, right? So if you want to be good at storytelling, read fiction, because they are the master storytellers, right?
And by the way, I would just want to add, one of the things I notice on LinkedIn, guys, are your posts. I tend not to do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, but I always look forward every day to seeing new work by you two, because you guys do that. You involve storytelling technique in your social media posts, and I think they're fantastic. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, it's I suppose we try to put into practice some of the things that we're telling other people, right? And it's not that anyone is a talented writer. I think we went over that last time, and that they can write, fantastic posts right off the bat. It takes, reading and understanding other people's work, and there's a lot of writers that I look up to on LinkedIn too. Just to touch on your point of technology, I think that could be a really interesting discussion. Writing technology,
truly,
for a future podcast.
There you go.
I don't know what you guys think.
Great idea. Yeah. We'll note that. We'll slate that for a future episode.
Great.
Speaking of which, fellas, perhaps it's time to wrap it up.
Takeaways?
Yeah, what's your takeaways? What are your takeaways?
So I'll go first, just because I've got a very quick one based on my book recommendation. Is to remember to read what you love. Okay, make reading a habit that works for you, and you can incentivize yourself to read more by reading things that you really enjoy. So don't forget to do that.
Yeah. Pete, how about you? Takeaways?
Yeah. So, that's a really good one. Motivation is everything, right? My takeaway would be, and Phil, you mentioned this, right? It's all about input and output, right? So you have to read books about writing to learn about the techniques. That's one form of input. Another form of input is when you read in the genres and on the topics that you want to write about, you should then notice those techniques while you're reading, right? So those are two forms of input. And then the output is clear, right? You then have to implement, right? So you have to practice using those techniques in your writing, right? And hopefully get some feedback.
I would build on that too and add that it's obvious, but we also need to write. We need to practice the craft of writing so that we apply the things we may learn from a book, like focus on writing, the techniques and nuts and bolts craft. We need to practice that. But also what I know from my own experience is that when I study a book of craft and technique, going back to what you said, both of you, is that when I do read something within the genre, I notice more. And when I practice writing, trying the technique, I notice it more vividly because I've actually intimately tried it and practiced it, however successful or not. And then when I read, more stuff pops out at me from the reading because I'm able to notice, perhaps on a deeper level, because I've studied the craft that lies behind it, but also I've tried it. So I think what we're presenting here is this great big loop, right? I don't know if that's the right metaphor. Maybe it's just all about cake. I don't know. They're all ingredients in the same cake.
Yeah. But in the end, it's learning by doing, right? So if you only read books about writing but never write, it's not going to work. You have to do it.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. You have to have your cake and eat the cake and use the cake to aid your writing.
Absolutely. And then you got to try again. You got to revise the cake.
We'll have to work on this cake metaphor before next time.
Yeah, it needs to clarify.
Don't we? All right, guys.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. Awesome episode. And we'll be back with another one soon, I guess.
You betcha.
Thanks for listening.
Guys, I wanted to ask you something before we leave. For the listeners and the viewers out there who tune into our podcast, we're open to ideas for podcast topics, aren't we? Someone asked me this recently.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we could put a call out for some ideas for future episodes. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Someone asked me if we could talk about things like what was the one suggestion? It was pretty specific, something like, can you guys explain personification? I thought, well, we could do that pretty quickly. Maybe we need an episode about figurative technique or something like that. So, but the question really is, are we open to suggestions? I think we agree that we are.
Definitely.
Great.
Okay.
Well, guys, been great seeing you again and chatting. Keep your eyes on that World Cup. I think Canada's going to take it.
We'll see.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time.
See ya. Cheers.